Good morning. I want to begin by acknowledging the gravity of the moment we find ourselves in. What is unfolding across the Middle East today is not simply a regional diplomatic realignment or a temporary disruption to trade corridors that economists might ordinarily categorize as a short term supply side shock. What we are witnessing is a structural transformation, methodical, deliberate, and accelerating, that carries with it profound implications for the architecture of global commerce, for the stability of energy markets, and for the long term economic positioning of the United States and its closest international partners. I do not use the word structural lightly. In my years at the Federal Reserve and at the Treasury Department, I have learned to distinguish between cyclical disruptions, which economies absorb and recover from with relative efficiency, and structural shifts, which fundamentally reorder the underlying conditions of growth, trade, and geopolitical alignment. What Iran has engineered over the course of the past several years, and what is now crystallizing into a visible and measurable trade policy posture, belongs firmly in the second category. Let me be precise about what we are discussing. Iran, operating under decades of sustained economic sanctions and international financial pressure, has not collapsed inward as many Western policymakers anticipated. It has instead constructed, with considerable patience and strategic discipline, an alternative economic architecture, one that deliberately routes trade, energy supply, and financial settlement outside of dollar denominated systems and away from institutions in which the United States holds significant institutional influence. This is not conjecture. The data supports it. Iran's non oil exports have grown substantially over the past 5 years, reaching figures that challenge the conventional narrative of a sanctions crippled economy. Its trade relationships with China, Russia, Iraq, Turkey, the UAE, and a growing number of Central Asian and African nations have deepened considerably. And now in 2025, we are beginning to see the downstream consequences of that patient construction work arrive at the doorstep of 14 nations that have historically aligned themselves with American foreign policy and economic leadership in the broader Middle East and North Africa region. The silence you are hearing from those 14 allies is not the silence of indifference. It is the silence of calculation. These are governments, many of them sophisticated, economically complex, and deeply integrated into global supply chains, that are conducting their own internal assessments of where their long term interests lie. And the answers they are arriving at are, from the perspective of American strategic and economic planners, deeply uncomfortable. To understand why, we need to examine the specific mechanics of Iran's trade bloc strategy, the commodity corridors it is targeting, and the particular vulnerabilities it is exploiting in the economic relationships between the United States and its regional partners. Iran's geographic position is, in economic terms, extraordinary. It sits at the intersection of some of the most consequential trade routes on the planet. To its west lies Iraq and the broader Levant. To its east lies Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the gateway to South and Central Asia. To its north lie the Caucasus nations and the Caspian corridor, which connects directly to Russia and the emerging Trans-Caspian international transport route. To its south lies the Persian Gulf, through which, as every energy economist knows, approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply transits on a daily basis. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point at the mouth of the Gulf, is one of the most consequential single geographic features in the entire global economy. Any nation that possesses credible influence over that strait possesses, by extension, a form of economic leverage that no sanctions regime, however comprehensive, can fully neutralize. Iran possesses that influence. It has always possessed it, and it is now deploying it with a degree of intentionality and sophistication that demands serious analytical attention. What has changed in recent years, however, is not merely Iran's willingness to use this leverage, but its ability to pair geographic advantage with institutional relationships. The expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Iran formally joined in 2023, provided Tehran with a multilateral umbrella under which it could legitimize and accelerate trade relationships that previously existed in a kind of informal gray zone. The deepening of the Iran China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, a 25-year agreement signed in 2021 with an estimated value of $400 billion in Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, energy, and industrial capacity, provided the financial architecture that sanctions had sought to deny. And the growing alignment between Iran and Russia, particularly following Russia's own economic isolation from Western markets after 2022, created a corridor of mutual interest and shared infrastructure that now stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Baltic Sea. These are not marginal developments. These are foundational reconfigurations of the economic geography of Eurasia, and their implications for American trade relationships in the Middle East are only now beginning to be fully understood. Now let us turn specifically to the question of the 14 allies and their silence. I want to be careful here not to overstate the degree to which these nations have formally aligned with Iran's economic posture. That would be analytically inaccurate and diplomatically irresponsible. What I am describing is something more nuanced and, in some ways, more concerning than a formal realignment. What I am describing is a growing hedge, a deliberate policy of maintaining public alignment with the United States while quietly expanding economic relationships with Iran and its partners in ways that reduce dependence on American-led systems. This hedging behavior is rational from the perspective of each individual nation. When the cost of opposing Iran's regional trade architecture rises because Iran controls transit routes, energy supplies, or market access that these nations depend upon, and when the benefits of close alignment with the United States become less certain, the rational response is precisely what we are observing: public silence combined with private accommodation. Consider the specific case of energy supply chains. Several of the 14 nations in question are net energy importers. They depend on stable, affordable access to petroleum and natural gas to power their industrial sectors, subsidize domestic consumption, and maintain the social stability that their governments require to function effectively. Iran, sitting atop the world's second largest proven natural gas reserves and the fourth largest proven oil reserves, is a natural supplier for many of these nations. Sanctions have historically constrained that relationship. But as sanctions enforcement has become more complex, as the rise of alternative payment systems, cryptocurrency-based settlement mechanisms, and Chinese financial intermediaries has created pathways around dollar-denominated restrictions, the practical barrier to trading with Iran has diminished considerably. The theoretical barrier, the legal and diplomatic risk of sanctions violations, remains. But the practical barrier has eroded, and for governments under pressure to deliver affordable energy to their populations, that erosion matters enormously. The agricultural dimension of this equation deserves equal attention, though it receives considerably less coverage in mainstream economic analysis. Iran has made substantial investments in its agricultural export capacity over the past decade, driven in part by necessity. Sanctions-induced currency depreciation made Iranian agricultural products highly competitive in regional markets, and in part by strategic design. Iran is now a significant exporter of fruits, vegetables, dairy products, and processed foods to markets across the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of Africa. For nations that import a meaningful share of their food supply, this creates a dependency relationship that is distinct from energy dependency, but no less significant in terms of its political and economic implications. A government that relies on Iranian agricultural exports for food security cannot afford to adopt an aggressively confrontational posture toward Tehran without creating domestic economic disruptions that carry serious political costs. This is not hypothetical. This dynamic is actively shaping the foreign policy calculations of multiple governments in the region right now. What I am describing in aggregate is a trade bloc strategy that is asymmetric in its design and cumulative in its effect. Iran is not attempting to construct a formal economic alliance in the way that the European Union or ASEAN represents formal economic integration. It is instead building a web of bilateral dependencies in energy, in agriculture, in transit infrastructure, in financial settlement that collectively constrain the freedom of action of the nations caught within that web. Each individual strand of that web may appear manageable in isolation, but the cumulative effect of multiple dependencies operating simultaneously across multiple policy domains creates a structural condition in which the cost of opposing Iran's regional agenda becomes prohibitively high for many of its neighbors. And when the cost of opposition is prohibitively high, the result is precisely what we are observing today: silence. As we move deeper into 2025 and toward the pivotal year of 2026, the question that American policymakers must grapple with is not simply how to respond to Iran's trade bloc strategy in the short term. That question, while important, is tactical. The deeper and more consequential question is whether the United States possesses the strategic and institutional capacity to offer these 14 nations a credible alternative, an economic relationship that provides the energy security, food security, infrastructure investment, and financial access that Iran and its partners are increasingly positioned to supply. That is the question that will determine the shape of the Middle East's economic architecture for the next generation. And it is a question to which, at this moment, we do not yet have a fully satisfactory answer. To fully appreciate the scale of what is unfolding, we must move beyond the diplomatic narrative and examine the hard economic data that underpins Iran's trade bloc strategy. It is tempting, particularly in policy circles that have spent decades framing Iran primarily through the lens of nuclear nonproliferation and regional security, to underestimate the economic sophistication of what Tehran has constructed. That would be a serious analytical error. The architecture Iran has built over the past decade is not the improvised response of a desperate, sanctions-battered economy grasping for survival. It is the deliberate output of a strategic planning process that identified specific vulnerabilities in the American-led international economic order and systematically exploited them. Understanding that architecture in precise economic terms is the necessary foundation for any serious policy response. And it is to that task that I now want to turn my full analytical attention. Let us begin with the energy sector, because it remains the single most consequential dimension of Iran's economic leverage. Iran's proven oil reserves stand at approximately 157 billion barrels, representing roughly 9% of total global proven reserves. Its proven natural gas reserves are estimated at 1,103 trillion cubic feet, the second largest in the world after Russia. These are not simply abstract geological statistics. They represent a fundamental endowment of economic power that no sanctions regime, however comprehensive, can eliminate. What sanctions can do, and have done with meaningful effect, is suppress the rate at which Iran can monetize that endowment by restricting access to international oil markets, limiting the availability of Western drilling and extraction technology, and constraining Iran's ability to attract foreign investment into its energy sector. But suppression is not elimination. Iran continues to produce, continues to export, and continues to earn revenue from its hydrocarbon resources. The critical question is not whether Iran can participate in global energy markets, but through which channels and on whose terms that participation occurs. The answer to that question has shifted dramatically over the past 5 years. China has emerged as the dominant absorber of Iranian oil exports, purchasing volumes that, according to multiple independent analyses, regularly exceed 1 million barrels per day, often significantly more. These purchases occur through a sophisticated network of intermediaries, ship-to-ship transfers, third-country re-exports, and financial settlement mechanisms that route entirely outside of the SWIFT system and dollar-denominated banking. The practical consequence is that Iran has a stable, large-scale buyer for its primary export commodity that is structurally insulated from American sanctions pressure. China's willingness to absorb Iranian oil is not merely an act of political solidarity with Tehran. It is a rational economic decision driven by China's enormous and growing appetite for energy, the significant price discount at which Iranian oil trades relative to benchmark prices, a discount that reflects the sanctions risk premium, and China's broader strategic interest in maintaining alternative energy supply relationships that reduce its own dependence on Middle Eastern suppliers aligned with the United States. This alignment of interests between Iran and China is durable, it is deepening, and it is fundamentally altering the energy economics of the entire Middle Eastern region. The implications for the 14 allied nations are direct and immediate. Several of these nations, I am thinking particularly of those in the broader Gulf Cooperation Council orbit, as well as Jordan, Iraq, and several North African states, have historically structured their energy relationships around American security guarantees and Western-led market frameworks. The implicit bargain was straightforward: align politically and diplomatically with the United States, benefit from American security protection, and access global energy markets on favorable terms through dollar-denominated systems that American financial institutions anchor. That bargain made economic sense when American financial architecture was genuinely without alternative. It is making progressively less sense as alternatives emerge. When Iran can offer a neighboring nation natural gas at prices significantly below international market rates, settled in Chinese renminbi or through barter arrangements that carry no dollar transaction costs or sanctions compliance burdens, the economic calculus for that nation's energy procurement officials shifts in ways that are difficult for political leaders to simply override through appeals to alliance solidarity. I want to be precise about the mechanism here because it is frequently misunderstood in public discourse. I am not suggesting that these 14 nations are making formal, declared decisions to defect from American-led economic frameworks. The diplomatic reality is far more subtle and, from a policy management perspective, far more challenging. What is happening is a process of gradual, incremental accommodation, a series of individually small decisions made at the level of energy procurement agencies, trade ministries, central bank currency reserve managers, and infrastructure planning departments, each of which appears modest and defensible in isolation, but which collectively amount to a meaningful structural shift in economic orientation. A central bank that begins holding a modest allocation of Chinese renminbi in its foreign exchange reserves is not making a dramatic geopolitical statement. A trade ministry that signs a bilateral agricultural import agreement with an Iranian counterpart is not formally abandoning the American alliance. An infrastructure ministry that accepts Chinese financing for a port expansion project is not explicitly choosing Beijing over Washington. But when all of these decisions are made simultaneously across multiple policy domains by multiple governments, the cumulative effect is a quiet but profound reorientation of economic relationships that gradually reduces American leverage and gradually increases the leverage of Iran and its strategic partners. This brings me to what I consider the most analytically underappreciated dimension of Iran's trade bloc strategy: the role of infrastructure investment. Economic relationships, as every development economist understands, are ultimately grounded in physical connectivity. Trade flows along roads, railways, pipelines, and shipping lanes. Financial relationships are anchored by banking infrastructure and payment system architecture. Agricultural supply chains depend on storage, processing, and logistics networks. The nation or coalition of nations that builds and controls the physical infrastructure through which trade flows exercises a form of economic influence that is more durable and more difficult to displace than any set of diplomatic agreements or financial incentives. Iran, in partnership with China and increasingly with Russia, has been systematically investing in exactly this kind of infrastructure across the Middle East and Central Asia over the past decade. The International North-South Transport Corridor, which connects Indian Ocean ports through Iran northward to Russia and onward into Europe, has received billions of dollars in investment and is now increasingly operational as a genuine alternative to the traditional Suez Canal route for certain categories of cargo. The significance of this corridor for the 14 nations in question cannot be overstated. For nations that import significant volumes of goods from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, a functioning north south corridor that routes through Iranian territory represents both a logistical opportunity and a political constraint. It is an opportunity because it can reduce shipping times and costs for certain trade lanes. It is a constraint because reliance on that corridor creates a form of infrastructure dependency on Iran that translates over time into political deference. Governments do not pick fights with the nations that control their critical supply chain infrastructure. This is a lesson that history teaches with considerable consistency, and it is a lesson that Iranian strategic planners appear to have studied carefully. The port of Chabahar on Iran's southeastern coast deserves particular mention in this context, not least because of the unusual and instructive role that India has played in its development. India, a nation that maintains complex and often tense relations with both the United States and China, has invested substantially in Chabahar's development as part of its own strategic effort to access Central Asian markets and to maintain an economic foothold in the Iranian corridor. The fact that even India, a nation that participates in the Quad security framework and that has generally sought to align its strategic interests with the United States in the broader Indo-Pacific context, has found it necessary to invest in Iranian port infrastructure, is itself a powerful illustration of the geographic and economic logic that drives accommodation with Tehran. Nations do not make these decisions out of ideological affinity for the Iranian government or indifference to American concerns. They make them because the economic geography of the region creates incentives and constraints that override purely diplomatic considerations. Now I want to address directly the question of what silence means in economic terms, because the word carries important analytical content that is worth unpacking carefully. When 14 American allies choose not to publicly condemn Iran's trade bloc strategy, when they decline to join American-led diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate Tehran economically, when they respond to Washington's requests for coordinated economic pressure with vague expressions of concern rather than concrete commitments. What they are communicating in the language of economic diplomacy is that the cost-benefit calculation of public opposition to Iran has shifted unfavorably. They are not signaling that they have abandoned their relationships with the United States. They are signaling that those relationships are no longer sufficient on their own to justify the economic costs of confrontation with Iran and its partners. This is a fundamentally different message than open defection, and it requires a fundamentally different policy response than the tools we would deploy in response to open defection. The economic costs I am referring to are not hypothetical. They include the risk of energy supply disruptions in markets where Iranian supply has become structurally significant. They include the risk of losing access to Chinese-financed infrastructure projects that these governments are counting on to deliver economic growth and employment to their populations. They include the risk of being excluded from the emerging renminbi-denominated trade settlement systems that China is building across the region. And they include the more diffuse but genuinely significant risk of being perceived by their own populations as having sacrificed national economic interests in service of an American foreign policy agenda that those populations may not fully support. These are real costs, and responsible governments weigh them seriously. The silence of these 14 allies is, in the most precise economic sense, a rational response to a set of incentive structures that have shifted in ways that American policy has not yet fully acknowledged or adequately addressed. As we approach 2026, the trajectory I have described will not reverse itself spontaneously. The infrastructure investments are being made. The trade relationships are being deepened. The financial settlement systems are being constructed. Each passing quarter makes the alternative economic architecture that Iran and its partners are building more robust, more functional, and more attractive to nations that are weighing their options. The window for the United States to offer a genuinely competitive alternative, one that addresses the energy security, infrastructure investment, food security, and financial access needs of these 14 nations in concrete and credible terms, is narrowing. It has not yet closed, but the analytical evidence suggests that it will close. absent a significant and sustained shift in American economic engagement strategy within a time frame that is measured in years rather than decades. That is the assessment that I believe the data supports, and it is the assessment that should be driving the urgency of our policy response.